the dichotomy is false which separates Palestinian from diaspora Jewry, ascribing orthodoxy to the former and heterodoxy to the latter, although such a view is popularly held. And this is false because of, and I gave you 4 reasons why this is simply not true, to make a cleavage or a distinction between the religious notions or the religious fidelity of the people in Israel and the people outside of Israel, the Jewish people. And I gave you 4 reasons why that's not true. And then I said that before we'd be completely through with that statement, I would end with a but, or with a qualification of that statement, that any separation between the two, saying that one is orthodox and one is not, is wrong because of these reasons, but we don't want to go too far in the opposite direction also. So here's what I would say with this qualifier. After we've got that long sentence, the word because, 4 reasons, then we have but. I do not mean to naively imply that the diaspora community was uniformly successful in resisting all inroads of Hellenism. In other words, we've said that they do not become Hellenistic, but that's not just an across-the-board statement that none of them became Hellenistic. Surely inroads of Hellenism were made with people here and there. So we don't mean to naively imply that no one, in other words, in the diaspora community was touched by the deep, technical, strict sense of Hellenism, where philosophy and morals, the entire way of life, and the entire way of thinking changed. That certainly did happen with some people. So we don't mean to naively imply that the diaspora community was uniformly successful in resisting all inroads of Hellenism. That would probably be asking for the impossible, that everyone, everywhere, at every time, under every circumstance, was completely successful in resisting all the inroads of Hellenism. We're asking for something that is impossible. There were people and cities both more and less successful in their resistance. There were times in which people were more and less successful in their resistance. We've got different people, we've got different circumstances, we have different places, different locations, we have different eras. We'll take that latter one, different eras. There are different eras of more or less accommodation to Hellenism. So we're saying that to separate the two and say that the people in Israel were faithful to the Old Testament, the Jews, and those outside were not, that's a false separation. The people outside of Israel proper, the geographical boundary lines of Israel, they were faithful to the Old Testament as well. But not all of them in every place on all occasions. Different eras of more or less accommodation. Take, for instance, here's one good example, and the best one I might add. The time of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the time of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Now, as we've studied before in ITP, that was kind of like a type of the end times. That was kind of like a type, if you'll remember back to those studies, kind of like a type of the tribulation period for Israel. She suffered as she had never suffered before during that period of the inroads made into Palestine by Hellenism under Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Here we don't have a people carted off somewhere, deported to another country. We've got the foreigners, the pagans from the north, the Syrians, coming right into Palestine and greatly affecting a large percentage of the people. That's what books like Maccabees are about. That's what books like, well, Daniel's prophecy, the 11th chapter, the 21st to the 35th verse, all of those verses, of course, as we know from earlier studies, are a prophecy of the little horn, Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Let me just give you a little, for instance. I don't want to spend too much time reading from Martin Hengel's book, Judaism and Hellenism, but on pages 103 through 105, let me just read some little clips The first one's rather long. It's probably the whole page. I don't mean for the rest of them to be that long. But here's what he has to say, and we'll come to an interesting point here of what's going on. And here we're not talking about diaspora now. We're talking about in Israel. What we're continually told by some groups of scholars, like Goodnow, is that outside of Israel, well, those people were apostates. Inside Israel, they remained faithful. Well, you turn that around. Oftentimes, those outside of Israel are faithful, and those inside of Israel are the apostates. It just depends on the times. Page 103 of Martin Hengel's book, Judaism and Hellenism, under a little subsection entitled Summary, the Judaism of Palestine as Hellenistic Judaism. They did say the Judaism of the diaspora of Palestine is Hellenistic Judaism. Let me get ahead of myself to critique what Hengel's going to say. Hengel takes this too far, but I'll say more about that here in a moment. It can be demonstrated from the Zeno Papyri that the Greek language, which is one form of Hellenism, a superficial form, known in aristocratic and military circles of Judaism between 260 and 250 B.C. in Palestine, was already widespread at the accession of Antiochus IV in 175 B.C., and would hardly have been suppressed even by the victorious freedom fight of the Maccabees. That starts in Daniel 11:32b. For the next few verses, you've got the period of the Maccabees prophesied, as you sang just a moment ago. They that know their God will be strong and do exploits, and the Maccabees certainly did. And that verse has reference to, well, anyone who knows God, but the immediate reference was to the Maccabees. Their very desire to influence the diaspora required the cultivation of the international language. One might almost say that it played the role in Jewish higher society that French played among the German aristocracy at the end of the 17th century and after. If you know a little of that history. Doesn't matter if you don't. This is confirmed, among other things, by the large number of Greek loan words in Talmudic literature. We've seen those back as early as Daniel's prophecy, like chapter 3 and all those musical instruments there. Parallel to this ran the adoption of Greek names, which followed an analogy with the Greciizing of Phoenician nomenclature and that of the Egyptian Jews, so forth. Let's see. In 175 B.C., this development reached its first climax with the construction of a gymnasium in Jerusalem, of all places, by the high priest Jason, whom we've studied before. Now, a gymnasium was not where you played pickup ball or shot hoop or something. It was a place where you studied. It was school. The process of Hellenization in the Jewish upper class then entered an acute phase. Notice the upper class here. The intellectuals are always the ones who respond to things that deviate from truth. Sorry for the intellectual. That's just too bad for them. They should go back and be dumb or play dumb or something. That way it'll keep you safe in life. You never know more than God, so you no sense in pretending that you do. The aim of which was the complete assimilation of Judaism to the Hellenistic environment. This was combined with a political aim. The foundation of a Greek polis, which is the word for city, in Jerusalem was intended to strengthen the privileges of the aristocrats friendly to Greece and to disenfranchise conservative circles, like Judas and his brothers. Presumably, Greek education in Jerusalem not only led to training the men in sports, but also had intellectual and literary elements. A Greek school must have existed in Jerusalem as a preparation for the gymnasium and to run alongside it. In later times, too, there are signs of a continuation of Greek education in the Jewish capital, meaning Jerusalem, which even included the knowledge of the Greek poet from the 8th century B.C., Homer. As a counter-movement, in other words, they studied the Iliad and the Odyssey in Jerusalem. The Jews did. As a counter, and you know what the Iliad and the Odyssey are all about, with their phantasmagoric views of the pantheon above. As a counter-movement to this, there developed a broader stratum of scribes. The culmination of this centuries-long development was the Rabbinate in the 2nd century A.D. Even in this movement, however, with its explicitly anti-Hellenistic tendencies, the methods and forms of Greek educational theory were adopted. See, you just find it happen throughout history. It happened with the Jews, who sometimes, as with the Rabbinate, tried to remain orthodox, and it's happened with the church down through the years that when you attempt to combat a certain error or a certain enemy of the faith, then in your combating of that, you accommodate yourself to it You have to pick up its forms like Philo had to do, as we discussed last time. Even though you can more or less remain orthodox or conservative or a traditionalist in your heart and in your faith, the liberalism against which you're battling all the time has a tendency to rub off. If in no other way, you have to pick up their terms to do battle with them on their ground. And that's a difficult tightrope to have to walk. And we've seen in our studies in Christian ethics that the church in the last few decades, as well as through history, has simply not been able to stay on the road. The neo-evangelicals are wanting to do battle with the liberals at their own game, in their own arena, their own schools, and so forth. And they come out of it tainted by liberalism. It's just impossible but that will be the result. So what he's saying here is that even the second century rabbinate, even in this movement, however, with its explicitly anti-Hellenistic tendencies, the methods and forms of Greek educational theory were adopted. And that has happened. And so Augustine had his favorite, like Plato, and then Aquinas had his favorite, which was Aristotle, and Aristotelian theory and Aristotelian philosophy was brought into the Roman Catholic Church through the writings of the so-called church doctor, Aquinas, and the reformers, a lot of them loved Aquinas, such as Calvin. And so they brought some of the theories of Aquinas, who brought the theories of Aristotle, right into the church then. Skipping down to the middle of page 104. On the whole, it emerges that Hellenism also gained ground as an intellectual power in Jewish Palestine early and tenaciously. Now listen to this one sentence here. From this perspective, now this is after 104 pages of writing in Martin Hengel's book. From this perspective, the usual distinction between Palestinian and Hellenistic Judaism needs to be corrected. Now he's right there. He said it's just a typical distinction that's made. There's Palestinian Judaism, and then there's diaspora Judaism. And he said this usual distinction made between the two forms of Judaism, one being orthodox, one being unorthodox, needs to be corrected. Here it is not only used misleadingly as a designation of subject matter and in a false contrast as a geographical concept, but tends to give a mistaken account of the new situation of Judaism in the Hellenistic period. From about the middle of the 3rd century B.C., these words are italicized, all Judaism must really be designated Hellenistic Judaism in the strict sense. Well, that's where I think he probably goes too far. See, his claim is the same as mine in square one, that this distinction between two forms of Judaism is false, that there's not a faithful and an unfaithful group. My reasoning is that's not true because basically both groups are faithful. His reasoning is that's not true because basically both groups are unfaithful. They are all Hellenistic. Well, and he says in the strict sense. Well, not in the strict sense. In a loose sense, we may speak of all Judaism as Hellenistic Judaism, as I'll explain later on, but not in Hengel's sense. I think he takes that too far. And then one more little clip at the bottom of page 105. These circumstances make the differentiation between Palestinian and Hellenistic Judaism, which is one of the fundamental heuristic principles of New Testament scholarship, much more difficult. Indeed, on the whole, it proves to be no longer adequate. Now, he says that this is just a basic theological, historical construct, a heuristic principle that New Testament scholarship builds a lot on. And I have no time of day for heurism. Heuristic principle simply means that you assume that something is not true because if it was, you could prove something by it, and so you go ahead and prove what cannot really be proved because that isn't true, meanwhile recognizing that the basis on which you're trying to prove something to be true is false itself. Sometimes we call them a theological construct. Technically, it's known as a heuristic principle, H-E-U-R-I-S-T-I-C. You can look it up in the dictionary. Heurism, I don't have the time of day for heuristic principles. Because you've got to assume something is to be a lie to prove something.
Oh, boy.
So he said, this is false. This proves no longer to be adequate, and I think that he's right here. theological constructs can be okay, but you don't want to use something you know to be false. I mean, if you want to use something that we're not for sure about, and then say, now, if this happens to be true, or if this proves to be true later, then this is the conclusion. But when you already know that it's not true and to still use it, it's beyond me. We have to count on the possibility that even in Jewish Palestine, individual groups grew up bilingual and thus stood right on the boundary of two cultures. You see, children that grow up, for instance, in, Houston or San Antonio or Austin, Texas or something, they often grow up speaking, I'm speaking of the Mexican people, Spanish as well as English. You're standing right on the borderline between two different cultures. This problem arises not only with Jerusalem, but also with Galilee, which had for a long time had special links with the Phoenician cities. We can ask whether some of the immediate circle of Jesus' disciples were not themselves bilingual. Well, surely they were. At any rate, 2 of the 12, Andrew and Philip, had Greek names, Mark 3:18. And Simon Cephas Peter, Andrew's brother, later undertook extensive missionary journeys among the Jewish diaspora of the West, which spoke only Greek. End of what I'm going to read from him. But that's interesting. We know that Andrew and Philip have Greek names. Those aren't Jewish names. Those are Greek names, Andrew and Philip. And whose brother is Andrew? But Simon Peter. Now, Simon's a good old Jewish name from Simeon of the Old Testament. But if Andrew, that's his brother. Andrew's got a Greek name. What type of family did Simon Peter come from, after all? You see, you can learn something from the name. And then let me give you another reference in the books of Maccabees. 1 Maccabees 1, verses 10 through 14. We're saying that different eras of more or less accommodation can be traced in Israel's history. And if you study the time of the 2nd century B.C., Antiochus IV, the period of the Maccabees, you see that Hellenism actually penetrated the boundaries of Israel itself. Verse 10, 1 Maccabees 1. A scion of this stock was that wicked man, Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus. He had been a hostage in Rome before he succeeded to the throne in the year, if you translate that into our reckoning, 175 B.C., 137 of the Greek era. At that time there appeared in Israel a group of renegade Jews who incited the people, let us enter into a covenant with the Gentiles round about, they said, because disaster upon disaster has overtaken us since we separated ourselves from them. What perverse thinking! Disaster upon disaster has overtaken you when you separated yourself from God. That's what caused your enemies to come in. But these people are all mixed up in their mind. Their claim is, well, if we just would have stayed, in allegiance with the Greeks and the Romans and the Babylonians, then all these miseries never would have come upon us. The people thought this a good argument, and some of them, in their enthusiasm, went to the king and received authority to introduce non-Jewish laws and customs. They built a sports stadium in the Gentile style, a hippodrome, in Jerusalem. They removed their marks of circumcision and repudiated the Holy Covenant. They intermarried with Gentiles and abandoned themselves to evil ways. And then 2 Maccabees 4. I don't need to read this. You can look it up yourself. We've covered this before. 2 Maccabees 4, verse 7, and then verses 10 through 19b. He just goes on to talk about the same thing. They even they bring a 300 drachma cash sacrifice to Hercules, of all things. That's 2 Maccabees 4, 19b. Well, I don't want to take the time to read any more of that. So do you understand what we're saying? We've got to be careful in drawing these lines and saying these people are Orthodox, and we're certain of that. At all times, on all occasions, under all circumstances, these people are Orthodox and those aren't. That's not true. There's an intermingling of orthodoxy and unorthodoxy with different people in different places. And we simply should not think, because this is not true. When you just think in your mind, now, if the Jews lived outside of Palestine, I know somehow they were more touched in their spirit by Hellenism, and they were more worldly than the Jews in Israel. That simply is not true, and that simply cannot be proven by the facts of history. Now, take note of a couple of statements here I want to give before I give a little conclusion to this part of our study. The Judaism, I'll have to give it in a sentence and then we can think about it. You can look at what you've written and think about it. The Judaism of Acts and Paul's epistles differs little, if any, from that of the four Gospels. Now, what have we just said with that interesting sentence? That sounds like it's just obvious and doesn't say anything. The Judaism of Acts and Paul's epistles differs little, if any, from that of the Gospels. Well, in the first place, you have to ask yourself, what was the arena in which these books took place or were written or whatever? Well, we know the Gospels, they took place in Palestine. All right, Acts and Paul's epistles basically took place out in the diaspora, with a few exceptions like the first half of Acts, but basically out in the diaspora. So here's my argument here. I'm arguing that they differ little, if any, from one another. If we were to subject them to a microscopic examination and pick every little detail apart, I don't think you're going to see, as the Jewish backdrop to Acts 13 through 28 and all of Paul's epistles, Jewish heterodoxy in the diaspora. Paul generally is not arguing against that. I don't think if we subjected each of those two sections, the Gospels being one section, Acts and Paul's epistles another, that in Acts and Paul's epistles you see Jewish unorthodoxy and unfaithfulness, and basically people who are Gentiles at heart out in the diaspora. But whenever you turn back to the Gospels, then you find a consistent, faithful Jewish orthodoxy in Palestine. I just simply don't think that's true at all. Here's one statement I copied down from another author. It says the same as what I just said, but it's in one sentence. The Judaism that Paul encountered in his journeys, which for the most part were outside of Israel, was distinctly and consistently orthodox. Now, I realize there are occasions here and there where he runs across a Jewish magician, like in Acts 13, and that's on the island of Paphos, and that's outside of Palestine. But as I've said before, well, there were Jewish magicians in Jerusalem. And regardless of where they were strictly condemned by the Jewish rabbis as being an aberration from the law of Moses, Deuteronomy 18. Yes, Paul found some groups of Jewish people who maybe tried to combine a little bit of Judaism and a little bit of mystery religion or Babylonian deity worship or something and end up with some syncretistic form, but that's temporal, that's localized, and it can be easily explained. That people all over the world, including those in Israel, are not going to always be faithful to the laws of God. Now, if we were to pick out with the religious Jewish backdrop a particular important argument that Jesus faced in the Gospels versus a particular argument that Paul faces in the epistles as well as the book of Acts, we see a difference there, but it in no sense is a difference between orthodoxy and unorthodoxy. Maybe I shouldn't embarrass you by asking you for those two examples, but if you'll just think, you could come up with them. Jesus is dealing with many different religious questions with the religious leaders of his day. Do you remember which one is the basic one that comes up in discussion? It comes up in life and living, in acts that he does? Violation of the Sabbath, right? Violation of the Sabbath is coming up all the time. He's healing on the Sabbath. He's casting out demons on the Sabbath. They're rubbing grain together and eating grain on the Sabbath. I mean, there are other questions that come up, right? But the Sabbath question comes up all the time. That is the chief question that comes up. Now, if we flip over into Acts, you see, if you can think like this, then it shows that you haven't only read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Acts through Philemon, Paul's epistles and Acts, but you can then sit and reflect on what you've read, and you're able to paint a broad picture. Not just, well, now I've got this verse known and that verse memorized, and I'm familiar with the contents of that chapter, but I kind of know what's going on. That argument, that question over the observance of the Sabbath day was an important question in the Gospels. Now, when you flip over into Acts and Paul's epistles, what is it there? Circumcision. Circumcision, exactly, over and over and over again. Now, here's what I find remarkable about that, and we don't have time to get into this question tonight. But if anything, listen, if the people outside of, Palestine are the unorthodox ones, if anything, why is it that the Sabbath question is the question of the Gospels and not of the epistles in the book of Acts? Because what happens with Paul and the early church? They stop observing the Sabbath and start observing Sunday as their day of worship after a shorter period of time, shorter or longer period of time. Why doesn't that become the great focus out there? That's an interesting question in itself. We could guess why circumcision wasn't a big issue back in the Gospels. Jesus was circumcised. He was a faithful adherent to the law of Moses. He had to do the law to redeem those of us who were under the law that could never keep the law. And whenever we see Paul with people like Titus in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 4, we know that Paul didn't have Titus circumcised. So that becomes an issue there. Well, anyway, here's another thought to think about. Maybe we can follow that line of reasoning to its end some other time. But here's another thought. Let me put it to you as a question. What do the Jews throughout the empire, now it includes Israel, but throughout the empire, what do they try to do to Paul? They try to kill him, don't they? He's being persecuted all the time, most of the time by Jewish people. The Jewish ones are the people who come into a city right after Paul has come and begun to plant seed and is somewhat successful and stir up riots and revolt and have him cast out of the city. They're the ones after him trying to stone him. Why are they trying to kill Paul? Now we're talking about the Jews outside of Palestine. Why are they trying to kill Paul? I mean, can you see my reasoning here? If they are a group of unorthodox people out there, then this guy like Paul would probably kind of fit into their theory, because Paul's kind of a rebel too, isn't he? So we're all together. No, they tried to kill Paul because they believed Paul was unorthodox. Well, you're hardly one to point your finger at someone and charge them of unorthodoxy if that charge could effectively be leveled against you. Do you see what I'm saying here? They're trying to kill Paul because, Paul, you're unorthodox. In your interpretation of the law, in your practice of the law, you are unorthodox. Only an orthodox person could argue like that. This is probably one of the chief proofs, and it's not one that, it's just one you have to think about. And I just came across this thinking about the matter. Because it's not like you can turn to a verse. It's kind of the spirit of Paul's life. The Jews outside and all over the world are trying to kill the Apostle Paul. Why would they be doing that? To a fellow who's like the rest of them, kind of syncretistic, mixes a little of this new doctrine, worships Moses and Yahweh and Jesus and resurrection and, many different gods. No, they level a charge of unorthodoxy against Paul. They can only do that because they are very orthodox themselves. That's a proof right there. Now, if someone were to say, well, now what about places right in the book of Acts, like chapter 21, where the Jews of Israel, of Palestine, of Jerusalem are trying to kill Paul? Well, they probably think he's unorthodox too. I guess that's the whole problem. And I guess that's the whole proof of the matter. That means both groups of Jewish people are themselves orthodox. But I think that, and we'll try to show this later on, be very easy to show, that the Jews of Israel, no doubt, no question about it, had a little geographical promised land pride to them. They would kind of look with suspicion on Paul because he's from Tarsus. And they'd probably look with suspicion on some other Jewish people who were completely orthodox, who didn't fall for this Christian nonsense, but completely orthodox in their Judaism. They'd probably look with a little suspicion on them as well. But it's not so much the question of orthodoxy or heterodoxy. It's the business of geographical promised land pride. We live in Israel. If you're really a Jew, why don't you move to Israel? And maybe they had a point there. But we have seen that God in His providence desired to have the Jews scattered all throughout the world. Paul, the early Christian apostles and prophets would have had nowhere to go, no doors open, no path paved before them, had the Jews not already been there. Because remember, they take their converts from among the Jewish people the proselytes, the half-proselytes, really, the God-fearers, and so forth. And you might note Acts 24:14. Acts 24:14 as a verse for this scenario. A lot of the Jews try to kill Paul out in the empire. He's unorthodox. And you'll see that in Acts 24:14. Okay, let me just conclude this then with two observations. There are two things that we could mean when we speak of the diaspora Jews as Hellenized. We could mean what I mean or what Martin Hingel means. There are two things we could mean when we speak of the diaspora Jews Hellenized. In other words, before I give you those two things, sometimes I might use the phrase, the Hellenized Jews of the diaspora. All right? I'm going to be telling you now how I'm using that. I don't mean it in the strict, final, ultimate sense that someone like Hingel evidently means. I mean it in a superficial sense, as you'll see. But you could speak of them as Hellenized. All right, here's one sense in which we could speak of the diaspora Jews as Hellenized. They adopted the more or less harmless aspects of Hellenization. They adopted the more or less harmless aspects of Hellenization. I gave you a list of things that would be included under the Greek way of life. Here I would include such things as dress, language. They certainly adopted the language. You had to live out in the empire. But that doesn't mean you become a pagan at heart and worship foreign deities. It could mean that. There's no doubt about the fact that it could mean that, but not necessarily. Advances in science. If someone's invented a new way to eat your chicken, then eat it the new way.